Thanks, Kim, for the introduction. And let me, let me just do get each of our panelists to do a quick introduction. Let's start with Chris Kubic, who is the CISO at Fidelis Cybersecurity. Chris.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the CISO at Fidelis Cybersecurity. I've been there about a year and a half, and at Fidelis, obviously responsible for the security of our corporate networks, but I also get involved working a lot with the product teams, just on, just overall improvements to product security, as well as I do a lot of customer outreach programs like this.
Great, thanks, Chris. Our next panelist is Norman Kromberg. Norman, if you would do a quick introduction, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Craig. As Craig said, Norman Kromberg, I'm with SouthernCarlson. Much like Chris, I serve as the CISO, Vice President of Information Security. That includes all things security, everywhere from identity management to network to servers to vendors to even including privacy and compliance. So my day stays busy. Looking forward to the conversation today.
And let me go ahead and introduce our third panelist, Morgan Wright. Morgan, if you could do an introduction of yourself, that'd be great.
You bet. Hey, welcome everybody. Morgan Wright. Some of you might have seen me a little bit earlier today, so I'm still the same guy, Chief Security Advisor at SentinelOne. Momentous day. We went public today on June 30th, so we're trading under the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol S. And we expect this to be the largest IPO for a cybersecurity company in history. And what does that tell you? Business is booming because cybersecurity is in demand and it's going to be increasing. So we're an autonomous cybersecurity endpoint company. Formerly, I was a senior advisor at the U.S. State Department Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, senior fellow at the Center for Digital Government, and really excited to be doing this because I think this is obviously this is very topical, and I look forward to this, Craig. So thank you.
No, actually, I was going to congratulate you on the IPO. I was just looking at the price, where it was at right now. Anyway, so maybe to just set the context a little bit, I think, for our audience, I think over the past year, we've seen an unprecedented level of cyber attacks. Those attacks have come from, various cyber criminals, from nation state actors. And we've seen a significant impact this year, right? If we look at Scripps Health, we look at the Colonial Pipeline, we look at JBS meatpacking plants. So, part of what I want to get out of the discussion today is really get into kind of each of your heads, if you will, and really start to think through and understand some of the strategies that you're considering when it comes to being prepared to defend and respond to these ever increasing threats. So let me start with maybe a higher level question. And if we will, I think I'll start with the same order that we did the introductions for the first one. So let me throw this to Chris Kubic first. So Chris, from your perspective, what are the big security challenges that are keeping you up at night?
Well, that's a good question. And certainly there are a number of things. I think I have to put ransomware at the top of the list. It's just kind of spiraling out of control with the number of new ransomware, attacks that are occurring, and the attackers are certainly getting a lot bolder in their demands for ransom, et cetera. So that has to be the top of my list. Certainly wouldn't have been on my list or wouldn't have been on the top of my list in prior years, but given all of the, SolarWinds and attacks that we've seen this year, I would certainly say supply chain and just increasing APT types of threats would be on my list. Compliance is a big thing, GDPR and CCPA, but more and more, compliance type regulations, data privacy regulations are coming out. So that certainly creates a whole bunch of challenges. And then, I would say just, as a CISO, how do you, take all this into account, factor all this in and figure out, how to prioritize your cybersecurity investments. So, it kind of ultimately comes down to us as CISOs to figure out, how much is good enough and where do I get the biggest bang for the buck in the cybersecurity investments we're making. And so, we have need to make sure that we keep our business operations secure and moving forward. So that's a big challenge. And then kind of moving down my list, I would say just being able to find and retain skilled cyber analysts. They're in short demand right now, given the number of attacks, and it's a skill requires some expertise, so that it can be hard to find these people. And then, I would say the final thing, and kind of on a broader scale, is just, given my background working in the government before I joined Fidelis, I've always had concerns for just how well we are prepared as a nation from a critical infrastructure protection standpoint. So that certainly keeps me up at night as well. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. That's a good list.
Yeah, I was about to say, Chris, based on that list, I'm not sure that you do sleep at night. So let's see, Norm, if you can either add to the list or, what keeps you up at night?
Well, Chris did a great job of articulating what's going to keep most CISOs up at night. The one thing I'd add to it that I think was embedded between the lines of Chris's comments is it's what we don't know. It's these things that are happening that aren't in the press yet, haven't been highlighted. We talk about 0 days. We talk about advanced persistent threats. We talk about these different threat vectors. And what I kind of use, there's a book I've read about, it's called A Contrarian View on Leadership. And I embrace the idea of thinking outside the box different ways. And unfortunately, the people on this call and attending this event are not crooks by and large. They don't think like those individuals do. So what keeps me up at night is just that stuff we don't know about and how it can come into the organization and how sneaky it can be and how simple it can be. And it will catch you when you're not looking, so we get all the ones that we see in the press, but short and simple is what we don't know. And how do we detect that?
No, that's a great point. And, there's actually some work at MITRE, and I'm sure you're familiar with the MITRE attack framework. And I think a lot of that goes down the direction of thinking about, from the perspective of the attacker, right? And understanding their techniques. And so, I think we'll probably come back to that topic a little bit, but it looks like you might wanted to have added one more thing. I saw the finger point a little bit, so I'll let you continue.
No, let's come back to it. I think you'll get to it, Craig, but you did prompt a few ideas. So let's keep going and we'll come back to it.
All right. And so let's get Morgan. I know we've covered a lot of ground so far on what keeps CISOs up at night, but besides the brightness of that shirt, what else can you add to the discussion for us?
It is Tommy Bahama, and you're jealous. I get it, but I've got more of these where this came from. Don't worry. Well, when it's already 100 degrees, it's like, no, I'm not dressing in a suit. I'll tell you, in kind of like what we were talking about a little bit earlier with Chris, I used to do a lot of work inside the government intelligence community. And it's not so much that it keeps me up at night, but I think one of our gaping holes is the fact is that we missed it was an intelligence failure. We missed the opportunity to disrupt the Sunburst campaign run by the GRU because there were over 1,000 engineers working on this. And we did not, 1,000 Russians working on it. Somebody is going to talk in a bar somewhere. Somebody's going to leak some secrets. Somebody's got to be working sources. So I look at the private sector can only do so much. The government can only do so much. But I think we've got to rethink the role of intelligence in disrupting these large attacks, because right now, I guarantee you, I know them like I know the back of my hand. The next campaign is already underway. SolarWinds was by the time we found it, it was over. They completed their operational goals, and we're on to the next campaign. And so what Norman was just talking about there, what's next? What's the next thing they're going to exploit? What's the next big shoe that's going to drop? And I'll finish with this. For me, the attack on Colonial was a watershed moment. I said this earlier in the keynote, and for those folks who weren't on there, I apologize. I'm repeating myself for the ones who were. But this has fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in cyberspace, because now we have criminal ransomware organizations replacing nation-state actors as genuine threats against our critical infrastructure. And how do you invade a criminal group? I mean, are we sending SEAL Team 6 in like we did with Osama bin Laden to go in and get 6 criminal hackers? No, that's not going to happen. So we have a huge policy challenge as well as a technology challenge in terms of stopping this. But what Chris was saying earlier, we cannot hire our way out of this skills gap. I think we're going to be rethinking about how we use automation, cybersecurity. It can't rely on people anymore. We've got to get better with machine speed responses to machine speed attacks.
Yeah, and fully agree. And maybe one of the areas that we'll explore as part of this discussion is the recent executive order coming out of the White House. And really, I think part of where you were going with some of your comments really looking at industry government partnership and what can we really do and how are we really going to make a difference this time. So I'll come back to that topic as well. So let me pose a next question. And Norman, let me start with you this time, if you don't mind. So considering the unprecedented attacks that we have been facing, what are you doing within your organization to prevent from being that next victim, if you will? And how would you suggest your peers prepare for the next big attack? So let me start with you on that one.
Good question. Actually, I'm glad we waited. So let's take the second part of your question. How do you prepare? First thing I would say to any of my peers is be ready, because it will happen. And rehearse, think through what you do at the point in time you are told you have something going on. Unfortunately, been there several times in my career, and what we have found is the bias for action and movement at the point in time you learn about it is so valuable. You just can't take away the need for being able to act to stop the bleeding, addressing the issue, whatever it may be. And that's the other key, is you can't have a standard checklist. Each one of these is going to take on a different personality. And you've already heard us referring to it in a lot of different ways. So the nature or the DNA of the attack will be different. So you need a flexible capability to respond based on what's happening. The other part, how do you prepare? I think it needs to get a lot more visibility. We all talk about the board. We all talk about the C-level. What's starting to hit me is we need to move it out of even the conversations of people on this call or in this event. We talk security. We talk in our little world. It needs to move out to say, what can somebody in accounting? What can somebody in finance? What can somebody in HR? What can somebody in operations, marketing help to mitigate issues that may be occurring? That could be detection of anomalies. That could be behavior of an employee. That could be not notifying. It could be something happening on your endpoint. Whatever doesn't feel right, they should report. So, we have all the different methodologies we talk about every day, but adding that part where the employees and other parts of the org, or even contractors, if you want to get there, can be key to this.
No, that's great. That's a great start. Hey, so Morgan, let me have you. Well, actually, I'm sorry. Let me let you continue. I think it was a two-part question, so sorry about that.
Me?
All right. Hey, Morgan. Yeah, let's move on. It looked like my side froze up. Sorry about that. That was me, not Norman on that. So yes, go ahead, Morgan.
It's kind of like, how do you prepare? All you can do is all you can do. But one of the things we've got to do is, I said this earlier today, big problems never get solved by asking small questions. I think we've asked small questions for too long. I have this framework. It's NIST 800 this. We're zero trust. Compliance policies, frameworks. If they worked, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. We would be talking about the decline of cyber attacks. Ransomware is expected to exceed $265 billion in losses by 2030. If all of these things were working well, then why are we having this discussion? So how do you prepare? I think it kind of goes back to what Norm says, and I know Chris will have some great insight on this too, but everything's unique. You've got to look at your environment. But I think one of the things we have to do is we got to start having discussions off of what is the most critical thing we have to protect, and then put all the wood behind the arrow on that one. We have too many people doing the peanut butter approach. They want to try and do everything, and we spread resources out. And folks, I'm sorry, at some point, you just got to realize some things may not be able to be defended properly if your limited resources only allow you to do this much. So those are some philosophical questions. There is no good answer about how you prepare but one of the things, and Norman was talking about thinking outside the box, that actually comes from an intelligence exercise that you do with people to say, how do our adversaries think? And I'll give you a great example of that. Solar winds, the sunburst, what they realized is that if we could get in and shut some of these other systems off, most people keep things in their sandbox for 3 days. And then what do they do after 3 days? Put it into their operational environment. So what did the Russians do? Let's wait 11 days. Let's wait 14 days. And then they popped their little periscope up. They looked around and they said, hey, we're in the operational environment. And then what did the software do? it executed. So it used flaws in human thinking and human behavior in order. We thought 3 days was it. Hey, all we need is 3 days or 14 days of EDR data. So, I just think we will never solve the problems of today at the same level of thinking at which they were created. That was Albert Einstein, and he's the guy that thought about the atomic bomb. He's the guy that thought about theory of relativity. So I think we've got to change not only our thinking, but the things we think about and the problems. I think we've been solving the wrong problems for too long. Elon Musk changed the entire space industry by simply asking, why can't we reuse rockets? So anyway, I think it's time to move out old thinking, really challenge conventional wisdom, wisdom, proverbial common sense, and have a new discussion.
Now, those are all great points. Hey, let's turn it over to Chris. And Chris, if you could kind of add to that, some additional thoughts from your side.
Yeah, sure. When I talk to folks, particularly on kind of how to prepare for the next big attack, I kind of break it down into 3 areas. And the first is, don't overlook good cyber hygiene. I mean, the attackers continue to use unpatched vulnerabilities, poor passwords, not passwords that aren't either reused or not complex passwords, et cetera. So, I think important thing is make yourself a harder target, focus on cyber hygiene. To Morgan's point, don't do the peanut butter spread across everything. It's important to prioritize your efforts, particularly with cyber hygiene, because if it was easy to do, we would have done it long ago. So we're obviously still challenged by that. And so I think the key there is to really understand, kind of what are your business critical functions, map out those business critical, workflows, understand, kind of what your sensitive critical data is, where it's stored, and also understand the risk tolerance for your organization. To Norman's point, you need to involve the kind of senior leadership into to really, collectively coming to agreement on how much pain is too much pain for the organization, and then build your cyber program around that. I think another key part of hygiene is just understanding what it is you're trying to defend. So understanding the terrain that you're trying to defend. So having good visibility across your environment. Obviously patching, you need to keep up with the patching, but if you can, once again, prioritize and focus on the systems that are critical to your business operations, or, those systems that are, exposed to the internet, exposed to third-party, partners, you can start to prioritize where you do the patch. You can make sure you do it sooner rather than later on those more critical systems. I think endpoint protection is, another key area, and, including, keeping those endpoints up to date and patched. Good antivirus for the known attacks, but I think also endpoint detection and response capabilities are important for endpoints, for detecting those more stealthy attacks, as well as, kind of helping you with incident response and kind of clean up on aisle 9 if you do have problems within your environment. And then, there's a human element to cyber hygiene as well. Kind of already mentioned earlier, but you need to make sure that your employees understand what your security best practices are, and you need to continually reinforce them so that they kind of those are kind of in their minds all the time as they're operating on the network. Kind of the second major area is active defense, I'll call it. Really just having capabilities that not only allow you to protect against those kind of known threats, but allow you to do the kind of threat hunting and analysis that's necessary to detect those more stealthy and sophisticated attackers, kind of the unknown attack vectors. And certainly, machine learning and analytics, threat-focused analytics can help there to be able to find those anomalies within your network and let your threat hunters kind of probe around those anomalies and be able to detect those, more sophisticated threats once again. And then I'll piggyback on something Norman said earlier, and that's you need to make sure you have a well-rehearsed incident response plan. I mean, when you're in the middle of an incident, that's not the time to sort out what your plan is and figure out who needs to do what. You need to have that, planned out ahead of time. And the more you can get that down to kind of a cookbook where everybody understands their role and what they need to do, the easier things will go for you when you're in the midst of one of those incidents.
Yeah, no, those are all great suggestions from our panels. So, let me take Morgan, you had mentioned solar wind. So let me kind of go down that path a little bit. So I think we all recognize that attacks are going undetected for longer periods of time, right? Solar winds, for example, remained undetected for many months, 6 months or more. So what are some strategies for detecting these types of attacks earlier in the attack life cycle? And if you will, what are some strategies for enabling organizations to perform damage assessment and remediations?
So this is going to sound self-serving, and I don't mean it to, but it's our philosophy, and it's one of the reasons we went public. And actually, Pratik asked a question earlier. He said, what about using AI to help detect and mitigate some of the threats? I think one of the things, our way of thinking about how we viewed the threat was reflected in the code that was found in the SolarWinds hack, the Sunburst malware. It specifically looked for SentinelOne to say, if we find it, we're not turning on because it will detect us, because it did not require an update to detect these types of threats. It really gets into behavioral AI. We're looking at the behaviors of things, not just people, but technology as well. And one quick aside note, the reason behavior is so important, and I know both Chris and Norman have talked about this, during World War II, the Allies broke some of the most sophisticated encryption the Germans had. Why? Because they understood human behavior, because every radio telegraph operator working for Germany or, serving Germany, how did they sign off every message? Heil Hitler. We now had 2 known words with word placings to be able to do cryptanalysis and break things. So this goes back to that whole thing about, looking at behavior. And that's what SolarWinds was really about too. It was about behavior. 3 days in a sandbox, move it out. So, and the whole thing too is we cannot hire a way out of it. You cannot staff the number of people it takes. We've got to fight. We've got to find a way to fight these fires more intelligently. And that doesn't mean we need to get 600 more trucks and 1,000 more firefighters, because they don't exist, folks. It's a fiction. You will never get all of that stuff. So it's about automation. How much more can we automate in the OODA loop, observation and orientation, to get down to a decision, making a decision so we can take action? If we've got systems and processes in place that can analyze, detect, and basically in the information intelligence space, it's called collect, fuse, analyze, produce, and disseminate. How fast can I collect, fuse, and analyze initially that stuff so I can have a human make a qualitative decision? But if you're putting a human in the loop, you're going to slow that whole thing down, and attackers will win every single time. Why? Because it takes 1 millisecond for one file to get encrypted with ransomware and spread throughout your entire organization. So by the time a human takes a look at it, you're screwed. I mean, that's just the simple way to say it. So sorry, folks. I think for too long we've tried to be politically correct about talking things. I said, when I see these attacks going on, when I see nation states, when I see criminal organizations replacing nation states as serious threats, when I see them exploiting SMB vulnerabilities that were known for years so that WannaCry ransomware could spread, that actually came out of the NSA toolkit, Eternal Blue. The one thing, let me end with this. The one thing I think we're seeing too, when we talk about how to respond to this, I'm telling you right now, Chris hit it on the head. You know how many exploits and how many compromises there have been because people failed to patch known vulnerabilities? Colonial Pipeline, one VPN account with a password that was found on the dark web that was reused and the account was not turned off was one of the ways they got back into that system. It only takes one. So I think we've got to learn better about not just to do AI and ML to do prescriptive things, but to actually be dynamic and detect things and lessen the manual labor burden of humans and put them more in a cognitive and a qualitative role to look at an environment and say what works best for this environment. So I think the rise of the machines, I don't want Terminator, I don't want Skynet, taking over, but I think we can find ways for technology to assist us in the response to this and keep humans from having to be in the loop and instead put them on the loop. And when there's an exception or something pops up, they can now make a decision very quickly about that, as opposed to drilling down through hundreds of thousands of rows in a spreadsheet, which takes 10 minutes to load onto a machine and is an effective denial of service attack against your SOC team and your IR team trying to figure out what's going on when it takes 10 minutes to load a spreadsheet. So we've got to get better at replacing manual systems with advanced technology.
No, and absolutely agree, right? I mean, those types of technologies really become workforce multipliers, right? To really allow the analysts to do that much more. Norman, I don't want to leave you out on this conversation, so really just wanted to get your thoughts as well.
Really interesting. So I was paying attention. I couldn't agree more with Morgan and Chris. And Morgan just highlighted a thing where, and I saw one of the questions come in, it talks about return on investment. And The challenge we run into is when you move forward on a lot of these, the ROI at the time is not tied to an incident or a ransomware or anything. It's tied to a business model of budgeting and all that. And they're thinking of margins and that nature. The challenge is when you have something happen, the executive's focus changes and all of a sudden that balance on ROI. And so I think we're facing a movement where we might have more avenues to explain this. For example, we all talked about the major ransomware attacks. Here's a reality. Cyber insurance is either not going to be available anymore or the price of it's going way up to where it's not worth it. Now, interesting theory. So back to what Morgan was saying, you think on a different level. Does that stop the ransomware because people aren't going to pay as much if they don't have insurance coverage? So does that dry up the funding source for the payment here? Something to think about. The other piece here is, and I think Morgan, you referred to this, simple things like accounts being shut down. So fundamental, and it's not glamorous, it's not fancy, but basic execution on day-to-day tasks. Because if you overlook one task, that could be the open door. So basic hygiene, repetitive nature. And then the other one I'll add is I think the CISOs need to embrace the idea they can say no. They sometimes have to step up and say, we're not going to do this for this reason. I know we hear all the time, you don't want to be the office of no, but at some point, your regulators, your boards, your executives do need somebody to say no. So part of that's being able to put in context why we aren't going to do that. And it could be that you're exposed on a certain area and you're not comfortable with that.
Hey, Craig, let me add one comment on that because Norman hit upon a thing. The old football saying is defense doesn't win you games, but it sure as hell loses you games. If we don't have a good defense, we're not even in the game. So you got to start from that standpoint. What Chris said about active defense, if we don't have a good defense, if we don't just do the unsexy stuff of shutting down accounts, shutting off passwords, tying identities to a person, so when that person leaves, everything they're tied to is shut off. As long as our defense is bad, they don't need to have a good offense.
Oh, absolutely agree. And defense does win championships, right? So, and that's where we
unless
need
you're
to be.
Nebraska.
Morgan,
no comment on that one.
This.
Norm, since Morgan raised the issue of Nebraska, let's talk active defense.
Sorry, football. Unknown to people, we've got an inside joke football war going on here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just share with them. We had a prep call. And we found out that Norm's a Nebraska fan and Morgan's a Notre Dame fan, and being the Notre Dame fan as well. And I can tell you, Chris Kubic is a Virginia Tech fan. So now that we got that out of the way, let's move on to active cyber defense. Norm, let me just start this question with you, if you don't mind. It's been raised a couple times. Active defense is something that MITRE has raised. They have a second framework as MITRE Shield to really complement what they've developed as part of the MITRE attack. So are you doing anything or is that a strategy that you're promoting in your role as CISO?
I continue to look at what it is. And active defense is an interesting term because does that mean you're going out and rather than being defensive and waiting, you're going out and embracing the enemy, working in their world? No, we're not going to do that. I don't have the time or energy nor the focus. But are there things that we're doing that can make it harder? So this concept of the automation, business rules, and this is where I don't mind being frank, I'm frustrated with vendors, especially the endpoint vendors. My business requirement would be if there's an anomaly detected on an endpoint, I want that endpoint off the network immediately and the user account shut down. No human involved, no action, anomaly detected, those two other events occur, and it's all automated. The basic response I've gotten from almost every vendor is, oh, well, we can let you know. Now we've introduced the human. And I'd much rather go talk to an executive and say, yes, you were taken off the network. Yes, your account was shut down because we had this. That means we probably didn't have a ransomware attack. We didn't have something else occur. So I don't mind having that harder conversation on a smaller scale than the broader. So, Craig, I think if you talk active defense going down that path, I would put those kinds of rules and processes in place. or reaching out when you detect this concept of shadow IT and just saying, okay, you signed them up. Here's your obligation to go take care of this in terms of multi-factor management of the administrative activities, things of that nature. So that can take on a lot of different forms of fashion. I just wanted to share those couple of examples of what I would categorize in there that I can control and do within the people, process, technology aspects.
Yeah, no, those are, really, I think the objective and some of the things that you're hitting on are really become more proactive rather than reactive in nature, right? And we talked earlier about the OODA loop and the idea of, observe, orient, decide, act, right? And it's all about making decisions and acting, right? And taking action, right? So that's a key aspect of it. And, I think that's part of what MITRE had intended in developing that really was to promote that. I know, Chris, let me ask you, you had mentioned it as well. I think actually you raised the topic of active defense. What are your thoughts on active defense and technologies that and processes, quite frankly, that we can use to be more proactive?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I agree with Norman. I don't recommend people, actively going out and going on the offensive against, a cyber criminal gang. I don't think that'll pan out well for you unless you have a lot of resources or you're a government agency, maybe. But I think you can be more active in defending your environment. So instead of, passively responding to alerts, I think you can be more active with threat hunting, kind of looking for those anomalies and those threats on your environment. And so I certainly include that in my, kind of three-step process for better defending yourself. Morgan mentioned, the cyber criminals, they're getting much more sophisticated, and I would agree with them. I think you were basically saying they're starting to get on par with nation states as far as their capabilities. That's certainly been kind of what I've seen. They're getting much more organized. They're working as teams. They're sharing access. They're sharing tools. They're sharing knowledge. They're being much more patient and strategic about selecting targets that are, deep pockets to pay ransoms, taking the time to fully exploit the environment, and find those that sensitive critical data that they can use for ransom. So it's no longer a smash and grab type of a thing. Much more longer time frames, much more sophisticated attack techniques, et cetera. And so so the companies that didn't really have to be too concerned about being a target for a nation state, those companies do need to be concerned about being a target of a cyber criminal gang, and with their capabilities getting close to nation state capabilities, we need to, really look at how you ratchet things up. And I think active defense is kind of the answer there. I mentioned before known and unknown threats. I mean, the known threats, some, those are fairly easy if you have good threat intelligence that's keeping up with the kind of the evolving attack techniques. Then you can, continually kind of tune your defenses to find those known types of threats and block them. And you can certainly put automation in place to automatically respond to those types of threats. But it's the unknown threats that are certainly the challenge. I mean, these are the things that we don't know about because they're either a 0-day, the attackers have changed their tactics and techniques. So it was previously known, but they've morphed, they've evolved, and so it's now unknown. And plus, we're seeing a lot of living off the land techniques now where they essentially become one of the users on your network. So it's very hard to detect that. It looks like normal use in a lot of cases. So, this is where active defense becomes important. And I'm going to disagree slightly with Norm and Morgan on that. I think you're going to always have humans in the loop when you're talking about those unknown threats, because it takes that analysis, it takes that investigation to really find those threats that we didn't previously know about. And so, but I do agree with you wholeheartedly. Let's make the humans as efficient as we can so that they can quickly identify those kind of anomalies, run them to ground to determine if they truly are threats and are malicious, and if they are, have automation to help them respond quickly and respond across the enterprise, in a much easier way. So automation is key. Analytics and machine learning are key to help, first of all, find those anomalies. But I think you're always going to have those humans in the loop, and you need to have those humans with the more advanced skills that kind of understand the adversary techniques and tactics and can be able to kind of track through those anomalies and find those attackers that are in kind of the proverbial needle in the haystack. And I'll leave it at that.
No, great points. Morgan, can you add to that, the conversation there?
Yeah, let's add a little bit of disagreement. So I agree with Chris that he disagreed with me on that because I think humans, in the loop. Hey, just trying to be politically correct here. I agree. Humans in the loop in one area is good. Humans in the loop in another area is a bad area because we're too slow and inefficient. But I think that your smart people who have been trained, they need to look at things that computers can't recognize yet. They don't have that cognitive capability to make value judgments. Now, one thing I will tell you. In fact, Chris, we may have crossed paths. I used to teach behavioral analysis out at the National Cryptologic School up there in Linthicum. And a lot of the guys got dependent upon polygraph machines. And so they lost their people skills. So a lot of it still is around people skills. But my challenge with looking at information intelligence, like the terrorist watch list and stuff, people keep saying we're looking for a needle in a haystack. And my thought was, you trying to find a needle in a haystack is an inordinate and supreme waste of time. What we got to do is get a bigger magnet, pull the needle out rather than trying to make the haystack smaller. And let's get efficient, because then that means the human can focus now on that needle and then, start doing their work. But if we're making humans sort through that haystack, that's where our inefficient processes get in. So I think, we're all in violent agreement on that part is how do we put humans at the right point in the loop and take them out of the wrong point in the loop that they're in right now and become more effective, because our adversaries, and spot on with what Chris was saying, and the reason why some of these criminal groups are getting the same capabilities as nation states, guess where they're coming from? They're coming from the intelligence services of the countries that they were in. So I guarantee you, when you look at China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, places like that, some of these folks who are in criminal groups, guess what? They've got backgrounds with the General Reconnaissance Bureau, the Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, GRU, SVR. We can just Ministry of State Security. A new Unit 61090, I think, is another threat actor that's focusing on the Asia Rim. So where are these guys coming from that are now our criminal threats? They were the former spooks and government threats that now are making a ton of money in the private sector.
So actually, if I could jump in on a comment you made about the bigger magnet. So I'd be interested what you guys' thoughts are on deception technology, because I certainly view that as a bigger magnet. Deploying deception capabilities, as part of an active defense strategy. In my mind, that is a magnet in and of itself. I mean, there's no legitimate reason for a user of a network to interact with deception decoys. So when you have somebody kind of probing those, poking around in those, it's almost 100% positive that you have attackers in your network, and you can certainly instrument those decoys to kind of monitor what those attackers are doing, and kind of use that as a way to kind of trace backwards in your network through your logs and your communications metadata that you have to find out, sort of how they got to the decoy and where they went after the decoy. So I kind of view that as a magnet to help you find that needle in the haystack. But I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Hey, real quick reply on that. I would say as long as the one challenge we have is putting too much faith in any one thing, because let's say our adversaries figured out a way to fingerprint deception technology and they knew it was there. So while you're focused on that, I would just look at human behavior. Oh, we've got somebody in the system and now we're all focused on the deception, as opposed to somebody's walking in the front door, because we did the old trick when I was a detective. Bank robbers, what did we do? Call in a fire on one side of town. We'd all go running to that side of town while they robbed a bank on the other. So as long as we don't fall victim to, again, traditional behaviors. But I think, Chris, you're right. I think if we can, the other thing we can do too is we can analyze what they don't change a lot of their time are their tactics, is their tradecraft. They might use different tools, but if they're good at getting into a network a certain way, then now I can take that and I can start using that from a threat hunting standpoint to say, where else do I see this in my environment? And quickly find those things. That becomes the bigger magnet. The deception becomes the microscope. I found my needle, and now I can use it to go hunting throughout the rest, because now I have a playbook. I have a piece of tradecraft that allows me to look to see where else they are in my network.
Okay, and just to be clear, I certainly wasn't claiming deception was the magic silver bullet. It's a component as part of an active defense strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you don't over rely on one thing your spot. We cannot over rely on one thing. Say this is the holy grail. Everybody's got to do this, right? How many people have we heard in industry say, "I have the magic solution. If you just buy this, all your problems are solved," until you have a problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the idea that I have a magic solution has ended up with many cybersecurity stacks, numbering, 50, 60, 70, over 100 different products in hopes that one of them might be that magic solution, right? And I think clearly that is not the case. And like the earlier part of the discussion has actually really increased the workload on many of our analysts trying to do that OODA loop, if you will, in their heads versus using technology to assist them. So, we've talked about a number of technologies. I'd be curious, just from the standpoint of each of you, what are some of those key technologies that you're really relying on today to defend against some of these sophisticated attacks? I have a suspicion based on our two vendors that are participating what they'll go to. But Norm, let me start with you.
Since I'm the one who buys more so than the other two people on this call, Thanks, Craig. Obviously, everybody's alluded to, you're going to have multi-layers. You're going to have that defense in depth, those kind of. But if you had to take one right now, what I've been observing is multi-factor almost across the board is table stakes for your defense mechanism and the discipline to extend it to all areas and keeping your processes around multi-factor simple. And then tuning it. Now, let's also assume they're going to figure out a way around multi-factor eventually. So thinking back to that idea of what's the next layer. So then I start thinking of, you already heard it, patching, your DNA, the infrastructure, keeping that basic. Then behavioral analytics. And there was a question that came in, does the SLA hold the vendor accountable? Well, it's interesting on SLAs. They also can be part of how you detect what's happening. So if there's an SLA that says you're going to complete everything by 5 a.m., but then all of a sudden there's behavior at 10, 11 a.m., that's outside the normal course and the defined SLA. Is that a problem with the vendor, or do you have something going on? So looking at across the board, but Craig's simple answer, I put multi-factor is the first one.
All right, great, thanks. Morgan, thoughts on this one?
Norm was spot on too, but then what we saw in SolarWinds and some of the other campaigns, or what we saw with Pulse Secure, there were people finding ways to get through that, multi-factor. And again, it goes back to, like he was saying, layers. You've got to, if this was a military term for you military folks out there, interlocking fields of fire. Do we have things that if one thing isn't performing optimally, we have something else that's going to catch it? And it's not stacking 100 things, I think, like both Norm and Chris were talking about, and hoping one of those will catch it. It's how do we intelligently overlap things so that as one thing passes through, the chances of it getting through the next layer become exponentially more difficult. And I'll tell you what it goes back to for me is part of the philosophy, is how do we transfer the cost of an attack more quickly back onto the attacker? If it's easy for them to attack our infrastructure, they'll keep doing it all day long. But I think Chris, Norm, both have talked about, hardening the target, making it tougher for them. If they've got to spend more time inside our network, hopefully they don't make it in there, but if they're trying to get in there, then the more time they spend doing that is the better chance that we have of detecting that activity. The more time they loiter and they dwell, on a certain target, the better chance we have of getting a human to look at this behavior and go, we've got something here because I see this coming, back again. So, here's the part for me. Represents SentinelOne, but I'm an advisor. I'm not the person on the ground. I'm not the CISO that's making all the decisions. So I have the luxury of sitting back sometimes at 30,000 feet and looking at the stuff. But when I go down and I look at the impact it has to me on a daily basis, when I look at just what the perception was when Colonial was hit, and people started filling their trash bags with gasoline. I'm sorry, Siri thought I was asking her to do something. I got to shut that off on my watch. When we start seeing our lives change, then I think what we have to do is say, then what we have done so far has not been effective. And it goes back to, What should the approach be? I don't know what the approach should be, but let me put it this way. I know what hasn't worked so far, and what hasn't worked, what got us here will not get us to the next stage of our evolution technically, and that's is how do we use more AI, ML, more technology, things to where humans now do more qualitative work as opposed to quantitative. They can spend more time actually doing really good threat hunting or managing the SOC or whatever, or making decisions. Chris, you too, Norm, you guys got to make decisions. Do you want good information to make decisions with, or imperfect? I'd rather have good information, but I don't want to wait ever to get good information, because as Patton said, a good plan executed violently today is better than a perfect plan executed next week. So, what are we willing to do? Violence of action right now from a cyber standpoint to defend our network. So I think there's multiple technologies out there, but do not forget the humans. Your carbon-based life forms behind the keyboard is what makes the company work. So not only is it training, but how do we remove them out of the line of fire and make them not the first defender, but maybe a second or third defender? We've got to change who the first defender is on our network.
No, that's great. Hey, Chris, let me just let you weigh in on this topic, and then I'll switch topics a little bit.
All right. Sounds good. So just to kind of piggyback on what Norman and Morgan said in earlier conversation, I mean, there's certainly no one-size-fits-all magic silver bullet out there. So you need a combination of technologies. But, I'd kind of put them in two major buckets. The first is, making yourself a harder target. So, Norman mentioned, multi-factor authentication. I think that's critical because, account compromise is certainly one of the go-tos for the attackers. Phishing and social engineering attacks are. So anything you can do with technologies to help, in that area. But once again, that's humans. Humans are in the loop there. So a lot of that comes down to just, kind of training and awareness for your humans on kind of what they should be clicking on and what they shouldn't. But I think you need some technologies there as well, because the phishing attacks have gotten so much more sophisticated than they were years ago, and they look pretty realistic, nowadays. Certainly, unpatched vulnerabilities, as we discussed, are go-to for the attackers. So anything you can do from improving your vulnerability management and just tracking of that and getting systems patched more quickly. I think that's key. So that's kind of all in this, cyber hygiene kind of bucket. But then I would put it in the second bucket is how do you better protect yourself against these more stealthy attacks? And so certainly I would put, active defense, which I've talked about there. And certainly a good way to implement that is with what Gartner, their category of extended detection and response platform. So essentially a platform that can, give you good visibility across your networks, your endpoints, your cloud, kind of what your users are doing from a behavior-based standpoint. And, as part of that platform, the tools you need to do the analysis, threat hunting and incident response types of things. I mentioned deception. I was actually not a huge fan of that before I came to Fidelis, but after seeing it in action and kind of having the discussions with our product team, I've become a big believer in that. I think it's a game changer. We've talked a lot, and I think we all mentioned, analytics, machine learning to kind of assist the users, help them find those more stealthy attacks, the anomalies within your network. And then, also, as we've discussed, automation and playbooks, so an active defense platform to find the stealthy stuff, but the tools to make the humans as efficient as possible so that we can get the most out of those skilled analysts that we have.
Now, all great ideas, guys. So let me just make sure I cover the topic of ransomware. I've seen questions come up about it, and really, what are we doing? What can we do better today? The things we talked about earlier were all recent ransomware attacks. So, are there different approaches that we should be taking? Are there different technologies that we should be applying? Kind of what are the thoughts of the group on this topic? And maybe, Morgan, I'll start with you on this one.
Again, got to just, I want to stay away not to do a commercial. So, well, let me tell you about a philosophy, I think a point of view. I think we have to start changing the conversation from how do we respond to how do we stop. That, again, that goes back to asking the big question, Nothing small, nothing big comes from asking small questions. So I want to start reframing this to say, we've got to focus on now stopping these attacks. You cannot stop Russia, China, name your country from launching an attack. We're just not going to be able to do that, right? So what do we have to do is we have to say, how do we stop those things from entering our environment? Or if they do find a way to get in, how do we stop them from executing? How do we detect very quickly? And look, this environment is getting more complex. You've got containers now, cloud, you've got IoT. I mean, my God, when I was first got on the internet with my Tandy 1000 SL and, had Netscape, Navigator loaded, and I'm thinking back then it was IPv4, and I'm thinking, oh, that's big enough for the world. And what do we find? We ran out of IP addresses. Now we've got IPv6. How long will it be before IPv6 is not enough? I mean, when we look at the exponential growth of this technology. So, I think for us, our philosophy has always been is let's not talk about responding. Instead, let's talk about stopping these things, not allowing them to execute. Let's rethink human behavior, because you know what? Many of the flaws come from biases in programmers. And I'm not knocking programmers, but I'm saying, because a company has a certain way of doing something, what do our adversaries look for? What do criminals take advantage of? They take advantage of weakness. And if they find weakness in our thinking, that's where these exploits are technical, but they're behavioral based, because they look at the way we operate, they look at the way we do things, and then the exploit is written around, how do I take advantage of the gap in your thinking, right? So I think, the technologies, again, let me leave it with this. It's got to be a combination of things. I wouldn't, as much as it pains me, because everybody wants to say we're the greatest. No, we're good at what we do, but we have a piece of this. Other people are good at what they do, and they have a piece of it. The question is making sure you pick the right pieces for your environment that match well, that you can manage well. And again, I'll leave you with this. When the pandemic started, people say, well, what platform do you prefer, Zoom or Teams or Google? I said, whichever one you're familiar with, use the one that you have and become very good at doing it. Because if you keep changing your mind, that's where the gaps come from. Invest in the platform you have, get really good at using it, and then figure out where your gaps are and close those gaps. But there is no silver bullet. I wish there was. There's no magic thing. It's just consistent actions repeated on a daily basis.
So you mentioned identifying gaps in your infrastructure. Do you have thoughts on using potentially the MITRE ATT&CK framework as a way to essentially think through where are your gaps? Because again, it's how do you decide where the gaps are? And I think the one thing I like about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right, it does identify the behaviors across the attack lifecycle, right, and how they're sequenced together. So is that a tool really for our peers to use to assess the effectiveness of what they've already invested in to figure out where the gaps are? It's
one tool, and it's a good tool. And again, I don't want to sound like we scored the highest in the last MITRE ATT&CK framework above everybody else. And so our point of view was we need to use more automation, more AI, ML. So I think, but again, it goes back to do not invest in a single framework. Do not invest in a single report. Do not invest in a single train of thought. Challenge the thinking that's out there. Get people to start asking tougher questions and make people start performing. So I like the framework because it makes people think differently, but that's not the only framework that does it.
Yeah, let me just get some inputs from Chris and Norm. I know I'm starting to run out of time. I've already been given a signal on that. So I do have one other question I'd like to get to the group. So if I could get some short answers, that'd be great.
Good luck with that. So you want short answers on what question?
Really was talking about...
you talking about ransomware or MITRE?
Yeah.
Ransomware. Okay. All right. Yeah. I agree with Morgan. I think we need to fundamentally kind of change the approach. I mean, we need to continue to do what we can to better protect and defend ourselves from ransomware. But in the end, it's very lucrative for the cyber gangs. It's very low risk for them. I think we need to come up with better ways to disincentivize the cyber criminals. And there was actually recently a very good report that was put out by industry. I think it was a ransomware task force, and they really talked about a larger role for the government and for industry in disincentivizing ransomware and cyber criminals, and they had a lot of good things in there. So I'd say on kind of the positive note there, I think Morgan, you mentioned Colonial Pipeline was a watershed moment. I think I agree with that, but for a different reason. I think that sort of caused the government to move ransomware into a national security threat kind of category. And so I think we're starting to see a lot more government involvement in trying to track ransomware payments, and actually kind of hold these countries accountable that harbor these cyber criminals. So I saw that as a positive shift and change in the government, and hopefully that continues, and we're able to kind of have an international response, government response to ransomware attacks.
So it looks like we only have a couple minutes left, Norman. So let me start with you, and I'll give each of our panelists about a minute if you can work within that time frame to really just kind of give any last messages that you really have for the audience on how to do a better job of defending their environments.
Okay, be happy to. Follow up on what Chris and Morgan just said. The one thing I would add on ransomware, design out of it. Don't just think you have to protect, but think about where your data is sitting and how can you place it in other ways. That means talking to your IT infrastructure, your business people. I don't know that we've always exercised the ability to eliminate the exposure by going a different way. A couple other points I just want to throw out. We've talked a lot about these major public risks and incidences. Think about the small ones. There's as much money being lost on business email compromise, these other fraud events, things of that nature, as there are in these large ones. And that's where a lot of this activity is occurring. So you can't forget about the other layers there. And one more, get close to the local FBI agents in your area. Your ability to get to them at point of incident and letting them know can be very valuable as you deal with things.
Great. Thanks, Norm. Morgan.
There's not much I can add. Agree with everything Norm and Chris have talked about, especially Chris, what you said about the government now getting involved. And I'll tell you here, let me give you Morgan's quick predictions. Number one, ransomware will now cause a fundamental relook at about how we manage cryptocurrency, because without cryptocurrency, most of ransomware does not occur. So, I mean, you have to have the ability to anonymously transfer stuff. Number two, if you're a CISO out there, get ready for government mandatory reporting of a breach within 24 hours. That came out of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee. We're seeing some of that legislation move through. So prepare yourselves for having to report mandatory reports into that. And I think the third thing is expect the next big attack, because we're not prepared for it. Expect the next big one, and probably the next. We always say, could it get any bigger, like the Yahoo breach or the Verizon? Or, this. We talk about hundreds of millions of email addresses. The next breach is coming. It's waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I guarantee you this. Point number three. Go to the bank on this one. It will exploit flaws in our way of thinking, and it will exploit flaws in our security based upon our way of thinking. So the next big campaign, Russia or China, I think we'll be hearing about it in the next. In fact, as we're talking today, Germany is getting hit pretty bad. Their banking and finance because of, guess what? Sanctions against Russia and Belarus. So Russia, Vladimir is taking it personally that you're sanctioning him, and he's attacking the German banks.
Thank you. And Chris, final thoughts.
Well, it's hard to, after all that, it's hard to come up with something else that we haven't really talked about. We've covered a lot of bases here, but I certainly agree with Morgan, on some of his comments. You need to be prepared for that next big attack. There will be another one coming. It's probably already in the works, as Morgan said. I agree with that. So, and I think we've talked about a lot of good strategies and approaches here during this session. So, I just recommend taking those to heart and getting yourself ready for that next big attack.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, Norman, Morgan, and Chris. And, it was a great conversation. And from what I understand, we're going to be going on a break. So let me take this session to a break. Thank you.